Israel has long pursued a policy of building Jewish settlements on Arab land captured during the 1967 war. It insists it has the legal right to do this, but most of the world disagrees.
The White House has just put out a statement on Israeli plans to build new settlements in the West Bank, expand existing settlements at the same time.
Angering some Palestinians who say it legitimizes what they view as illegal Israeli settlements.
Settlements.
With settlements.
These settlements are
If you've ever looked into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, one of the words that will come up sooner or later is the settlements. Israelis who have built settlements in Judea and Samaria, also known as the West Bank. The settlers, we are told, are extremists who are making a future peace between Israel and the Palestinians harder to achieve. Why? Because these settlements will make it more difficult to carve out a future Palestinian state. But who are these settlers? What is motivating them to live in these contentious regions? And are they making peace more difficult to achieve? My name is Roger Walters. I'm a British businessman. I have a deep love for Israel, and over the past few years, I've had a growing curiosity to understand the issues underlying Israel settlements. So the best way to find out was to go and meet these settlers, to find out the human stories beneath the politics. In this documentary, I'm going to be speaking directly to the people living across these settlements, to put a human face on the people we are told are extreme ideologues. I'll also be speaking to Palestinians who live beside them, those who work with them and those who detest them. And I'll be speaking to advocates, politicians and legal experts on both sides of the debate to understand the moral, historical and legal issues that underlie this subject. Join me on my journey to settle the facts. I'm in my home in London, and I first wanted to hear from some of the people campaigning against the Israeli settlers to understand the complaint lodged against them.
I am Isa Amro. I'm a Palestinian human rights defender. I founded many groups, and the famous one is Youth Against Settlement. It's a Palestinian non-partisan group. The main idea of this group is to increase the cost of the Israeli occupation. And occupation is the main feeder of extremism and the main feeder of, let me say, violence all over.
So if you support the two-state solution, you cannot accept settlements. And if you don't, then I'm asking you, what do you actually support? Because if you don't see the settlements as a barrier for peace, then I cannot see anything that you can support beside a Jewish supremacist state.
I think the Israeli mentality of not seeing Palestinians as equal human beings is the main issue. Then the Israeli settlements is the second for me. More and more settlers are coming to live in the West Bank, and there is a lot of measures to make it one state.
Those arguing against Israel's settlers are clear. They're destroying the prospects for peace, and they're a negative force in the Middle East. To really understand what this is all about, we need to dig deeper into the history of these areas, to understand what international law really says, and to consider the moral questions surrounding this complex issue. But before we get to that, I wanted to meet the settlers in person, to see for myself who these controversial figures are. Let's meet the people at the heart of this. First up, we headed to Itamar, located in the Sumerian mountains, where I met pottery designer Batya Erstein.
Well, I'm from San Diego, California, and the thing that brought me to Israel is just my desire to connect to the land of Israel and to the Jewish people. I just feel that focusing on love and bringing light into the world and doing the things that we're meant to do while we're here, the light will just overcome everything.
Batya teaches pottery workshops for all ages, as well as special needs groups, and recently opened a gallery of her own products in Itamar.
Like this actually is wildflowers that I've picked here, and it symbolizes that the Jewish people are back in the land. This is like fossilized pieces of all kinds of leaves and flowers that are dried out and then pressed into the clay.
In the same settlement of Itamar, I met Shimon Barda, originally from France, and who set up Itamar Perfumes in 1994, which produces all natural deodorants, perfumes and creams.
My dream was to come to Israel and do something, to return to the roots and live the Bible life.
We read in the Torah last Shabbat about Abraham, and I told my little children, open the window and look, he walked from Shechem here to Bethel, he walked this way. When I come to here, I feel him.
I opened up the bakery, Erev Rosh Hashanah, 1989. You say, why would you want to come into a hostile environment? So there is no place that's not a hostile environment. Not in Israel, not in Europe, not in America, not anywhere. So I choose to live here. Nice atmosphere, nice community.
We are here for 14 years. All my children was born here.
You don't have any worries about them?
Sometimes it's hard, yes. I have a son that goes every morning 20 minutes by a bus to his school, and sometimes I worry. We don't live in a fear all the time.
לא צריך שלמדריך יהיה נשק, אנחנו אומרים להם, מה פתאום? זה לא נכון, זה כל כך רגוע, כל כך שקט. כשיש בעיות בתוך ישראל, כשהיה שנה שעברה את המאורעות בתוך ישראל עם הערבים הישראלים, כולם ברחו לפה. אמרנו להם, הנה כאן אנחנו, לרגע אחד השלום והאיזון והחברות לא הופרה. באו לפה, אנשים פחדו לצאת למרכז תל אביב, למרכז ירושלים, למרכז הערים המעורבות, הם באו לפה, ופה הם הרגישו בטוחים. כי פה זה באמת יש לנו יחסי שכנות. באמת יש לנו, זה לא... באמת אנחנו ביחד.
I originally moved to Israel in 2005. I lived in a whole bunch of different places in that time, one of them being a kibbutz up north. I did the army there as a lone soldier. And one of the places I served in the army was not too far from here. And I just remembered being like, wow, this place is gorgeous. I want to live here one day. And then that one day became. I moved here. I've been living here since around 2013. I raised my 3 boys here. My business is here. I make natural cosmetics. And I love the area. I'm surrounded by nature. The earth here I feel is holier. The neighbors, it's a community. Everyone here is very welcoming and very loving and very giving. And like I said, the area, I believe it's really important for us to live here.
In all my life, I dream about farming, that it will mix all the things that I love. I love people, so I want to host. I want it to be a touristical one. I love music, so I have a lot of music in here, instruments and bands, and we do have a lot of Bedouin in here. And we find it's all right. Respect, suspect, but we have a nice relationship. And with the Jewish settlers here around, even that I'm not religious or something like that, and all the area is more religious than me. A lot of hospitality, a lot of warm, hard, and willing and helping. And I feel I'm lucky.
Next, we headed to Lipsky Plastics Manufacturing Factory in the settlement of Barkan. CEO Yehuda Cohen employs 75 Palestinians along with Israeli Arabs and Jews.
My factory is Lipsky, a plastic factory that produces injection molding machine, extrusion and pressing machine. In the beginning I rent this building, after that I bought it, and I need workers, and I found people who need work. Then it's win-win situation. And this is the only reason why am I here.
I chose to live in this region together with my wife. We made this choice because we both served in intelligence units in the army. And we think this region is strategically crucial for Israel because it's like in the center of the land and it's a ridge of mountains. And there is a lot of descriptions in the Bible about David having met Abigail in this region, whole story about Carmel and Maon, and Psalms which are written in caves in Maon, which is a place nearby Carmel. We found a region which is very unique in many aspects, one of which is the unique flora. So here we have an example. This is called Origanum Dei, which translates from Latin, the holy oregano.
I made Aliyah about 18 years ago, and I always lived in what's called the settlements, right, in Judea. When I came, I didn't even realize, I guess I was naive, I didn't even realize there was a difference between one side and the other. This has been a project of passion and purpose, and has taken so much of my time personally over the years. We get cacao from Peru, from Ecuador, Venezuela, Madagascar. We've worked with farmers in the Philippines.
We live in a community. Everyone takes care of everyone. If I'm missing anything in the middle of baking, text in the group who has sugar. 9 years ago, I started Arbel Natural Beauty. I just love creating formulas, making them up on the way, investigating, seeing people might have and helping them find calmness and health with it.
In Kfar Adumim, which is a settlement close to Jericho, I met olive oil farmer and producer Boaz.
This is our land, okay? This is the tribe of Judah. We are in the middle between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, and we have story of Abraham. It's on the Jordan Valley, so we are in the middle.
Still in Kfar Adumim, I met sheep farmer Naama Atidia.
הגענו לכאן בעצם בשנת 2004, 2004, הגענו. אני הייתי בסך הכל בחורה בת 20. הכרתי את עומר, הבן זוג שלי, בן 28, עדיין רק הכרנו, ובעצם הגענו לפה. עשינו איזשהו טיול, הלכתי לבקר את אחותי שעבדה באיזה חווה, ונסענו דרך השטח, דרך מדבר יהודה לפה, הגענו לכאן 2 ג'יפים באיזה שבת, ולא היה פה כלום. הייתה פה שממה, וישבנו על איזה גבעה פה, והסתכלנו על כל השטח, ושאלתי את עומר, מה זה המקום הזה? אז הוא הסתכל לי בעיניים ואמר לי, הולך לקום פה מקום יפה בארץ ישראל. באנו כדי להפריח את השממה, באנו כדי ליישב את ארץ ישראל, באנו כדי להגיע לאזורים היותר נידחים, אלה שפחות אנשים אוהבים לבוא לגור שם. גם כל יישובי בקעת הירדן עדיין יישובים קטנים, בקעת הירדן היא כמו החצר האחורית של המדינה, וגם להכניס פה גן עדן, ממש להפריח גן עדן בשממה, זה היה החלום.
We are a very big company, around 600 workers. Palestinian, Israelis, we're working very hard. We don't get any money from the government or something like this. We need to create the business, and at the end of the day, to bring profit to the towns.
I've been all over the world. I've been also all over Israel. In Judea and Samaria, you have a very, very good life. Almost 40 families will live on this hill. It's called Sde Boaz. It means the field of Boaz. And it's from the Bible. You have the legend of Ruth. In the end, Ruth, she's getting married to a local governor that's called Boaz. And his fields were in the south of Bethlehem. So when the first guys that built this hill came, and they really felt we came back to the field of Boaz.
זה הבית שלך. זהו, זה פשוט בית. וזה משהו שהוא הרבה יותר רוחני, רגשי, עם קשר מאוד מאוד עמוק, שלא תמיד אפשר להסביר את זה בשכל. אם אני מרגישה בטוחה. אני מצד אחד מרגישה הכי בטוחה בעולם, מצד שני, אני מתמודדת פה, כן, עם מציאות שיש פיגועים קרובים, או כל מיני אופציות שהן לא בדיוק בטיחותיות, וזה לא כיף לי לחשוב שדבר כזה עלול חס וחלילה לקרוא לאנשים שקרובים לי. ומצד שני, כל פעם שאני חושבת, אוקיי, אז לאן אני אלך? אז באמת שאין לי, זה מרגיש שאין לי בחירה ואין לי מקום אחר ללכת אליו.
נתחיל קצת אחרי שעברנו מגוש קטיף להנה. אנחנו גרנו בגוש קטיף, ביישוב נצרים שהיה במרכז רצועת עזה, ועברנו לפה, לכוכב השחר בבנימין. ולפני כ10 שנים הקמנו את המפעל הזה, שבעצם הוא בראש ובראשונה מפעל שנוצר בשביל להעסיק אנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים, וזה נבע מתוך צורך אישי. יש לנו בן עם תסמונת דאון.
The Jewish people can trace their history in this land for over 3,000 years. And there's all kinds of historical and archaeological evidence to prove it. There were 2 Jewish kingdoms here, the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judah, both of which were destroyed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And in 70 CE, the Romans exiled the Jews from the land, renaming it Syria-Palestinia. This was intended to sever the Jewish connection to the land. Palestina was a reference to the Philistines, the ancient enemy of the Jews who no longer existed at this point in history. The name Palestine gradually came into common usage in the centuries that followed, but that wasn't the end of the Jews in this land.
What people forget is that some Jews did remain in that land and continued to live in that land until modern times. So Jews, while the vast majority ended up in exile, scattered around the world, and not just in Europe, but also in the Middle East, you also had this continuous Jewish presence in this land for the last 3,000 years, unbreakable.
And since the destruction of the Jews' Second Temple until the modern era, Jews throughout all generations maintained a connection to the land, praying daily to return home. Fast forward to the 7th century, where the Arab Muslims emerged in the world and Islam spread out to the Arabian Peninsula through Islamic conquest. In 638 CE, the Arab Muslims conquered Jerusalem from the Byzantine Christians, and Arab tribes started to settle in this land. Over the next 1,300 years, more Arabs and Muslims joined these communities.
We've both been there. We both have what would be known internationally as long-standing presence in this land. So the idea that somebody can come and now say one is a colonialist, no. The Jews are indigenous to that land. They've been there for 3,000 years. I speak the language of Hebrew. That's a language that was invented in that land. Meanwhile, Arab Muslims have also now been there for over 1,000 years. Now you could claim, and you could say it's true to say, they were colonizers in the 7th century. They were. They came, they conquered the land, they instilled their traditions, their language, their values. That's colonization. What we have to, I think, establish for everybody is, Jews have claims to that land, as do Arabs, who are today now took on the national identity of Palestinians. And that's the basis that we should lay for anybody who's going to have this conversation. When we get to land ownership, things get a lot more complicated, because for a long time there wasn't such a thing as land ownership.
That's because for a long time, empires controlled land and private land ownership was uncommon. In the late 19th century, and after almost 2,000 years of persecution in the diaspora, modern Zionism emerged in Europe as an idea to provide a refuge for Jews in their ancient homeland. These early Zionists found local Arab landowners to be willing sellers because economic conditions were extremely tough and the rewards from land sales looked appealing. However, this led to tensions because the Arab landowners often had Arab tenants, unaware that the land where they resided was now owned by Jewish landlords. Having said that, by 1948, when the State of Israel was officially declared, only around 20% of the land was privately owned. The majority of the land was public. After World War I, the British Empire took control of the land. As a point of interest, it's worth noting that at this time, Jews living in the British Mandate were known as Palestinians, just like the Arabs. Between 1939 and 1945, the Holocaust saw the systematic extermination of 6 million Jews by the Nazis during World War II. Many Jews found themselves unable to emigrate to other countries. The world closed its doors on the Jews, and there was no escape. 1/3 of the world's Jewish population were wiped out, and this massively bolstered the Zionist cause. As more Jews migrated to Palestine, tension rose between Arabs and Jews. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was the highest religious authority for the Muslim community in Palestine during the British Mandate. He was an influential voice in the Arab nationalist movement and an outspoken opponent of Jewish immigration to Palestine. During the 20s and 30s, he was involved in anti-British and anti-Zionist activities, including organizing violent uprisings against the British authorities and inciting anti-Jewish riots. In 1941, the Grand Mufti met with Adolf Hitler in Berlin. During this meeting, he sought Hitler's support for the Arab nationalist movement and discussed ways to collaborate against the British and Jews in the Middle East. The Grand Mufti was an outspoken supporter of the Nazi regime and was later accused of having aided the extermination of Jews in Europe. After World War II, the British handed over control of Palestine to the United Nations. On November the 29th, 1947, the UN passed a partition plan which proposed a two-state solution, a state for the Jews and a state for the Arabs side by side. The Jews accepted this plan, while the Arab leadership rejected it. On November the 30th, Arab militias began a war which was known as the War of Independence.
You had an offer that would have given you 45% of the land, but the Jews would have 55% of the land. And let's acknowledge that 60% of the land that was given to the Jews was arid desert in the south. So when we talk about quality of land, it was equal. And one could even argue the Arabs got more quality land than the Jews got. But regardless, okay, fine, you didn't want to accept it, don't accept it. You wage a war, expecting to win that war, but you didn't. And now it's my fault? Do you know what I mean? So of course you don't have to abide by it. But when you make the decision to go and wage a war, well then that's on you, the result of that war. And the result of that war was them losing. Now, thank God, because what was the ultimate goal of that war was for Israel to not exist. By the end of that war, circumstances happened that led to confiscation of land. If you come and show true land ownership of land that currently is in Israel proper that you can't access, you can get compensated for it.
Israel's War of Independence led to the displacement of an estimated 700,000 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, what they refer to as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. But the war also led to the displacement of 850,000 to 900,000 Jews, who were kicked out of Arab countries in 1948 and were absorbed by the State of Israel. In 1948, the territory that was declared as Israel was recognized as sovereign Israeli territory by the world, but the West Bank and Gaza were not. What happened to these territories? During the War of Independence, the Jordanians and Egyptians conquered these territories and tried to annex them, but the world did not recognize it. One thing is for certain, the world acknowledges that it was never meant to be under the control of either Jordan or Egypt. The term West Bank comes from the Jordanians who conquered and controlled the territory from 1949. During this time, the Jordanians treated the territory as part of Jordan, giving citizenship to residents, but not to Palestinian refugees. However, during this period, no Jews were living in the area, as the Jordanians ethnically cleansed the Jews from the territory during the War of Independence. But to many people, especially Jews, the land that the Jordanians called the West Bank is actually Judea and Samaria, which is made up of the Samaritan mountains to the north, the Judea mountains to the south, and the Judean desert to the east. And the first time a line was officially drawn around this territory was in 1949 as part of the Armistice Line to end the War of Independence. There was no legal or historical reason for this boundary. It was simply where the soldiers on both sides were located when the ceasefire was declared. Fast forward to 1967. All of Israel's Arab neighbors once again sought to annihilate the nascent Jewish state and built a huge force ready to attack. This was preempted by Israel, who successfully ended the offensive in 6 days.
In September of 1967, so very soon after this war ends, Jews will slowly return and reclaim their land as well. Let's remember that in 1967 until 1977, we will have a left-wing government in Israel. Not a religiously ideological government that would go and settle the land of Judea and Samaria for biblical religious reasons, but they did settle the land. They did build settlements. Where? In the Jordan Valley and along the hilltops of the West Bank. And the reason for this was very simple: security. The Jordan Valley to prevent a future Jordanian invasion, that there would be people there in the way if they choose to do it yet again. And on the hilltops to protect 70% of Israel's population that sits in the coastal plain of Israel in places like Tel Aviv. In 1977, though, we have a flip of the government. A right-wing leader takes over, Menachem Begin, and he does say we can go and settle land that was once biblically Jewish. Where these settlements are built is approved by the government. You have to get a permit from the government to build, and the government gave out permits on land that they believed to be public land. Land, again, administered by the government, and at that time, the government in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria, the administration, was a military administration according to the Geneva Conventions. We have to understand context, which is very important. 1967, the PLO had been founded 3 years earlier, in 1964. In the PLO charter, it doesn't speak about the West Bank and Gaza. What they speak about is Israel proper, liberating what they would call Palestine from Israel, from the Jews. Why not the West Bank and Gaza? Because those territories were under Jordanian and Egyptian control, respectfully. So the idea of independent Palestinian nationalism had not yet fully formed. It was, let's liberate this land from the Jews, and maybe it'll become an independent state, or maybe it'll just become part of Syria or part of another entity, or part of Jordan, whatever it was. The 1970s was a decade of terror coming from the Palestinians, not just inside of Israel proper, but all over the world. 1988 rolls around, and Arafat does something brilliant. He goes to the UN, and he tries to declare independence, not in Israel proper, according to the PLO charter, but in the West Bank and Gaza, now also under Israeli control. Let's understand that prior to this, the Palestinians were seen as terrorists. With all due respect to the Palestinians. In 1988, that shift of rhetoric changes everything, because now the movement for the Palestinians becomes a movement of ending occupation. Free Palestine is now the hashtag. And that emerges in 1988, and all of a sudden, slowly but surely, world support shifts because now they're no longer terrorists, they're freedom fighters. And settlements become these settler colonies rather than just communities that emerged in what would be known as a disputed territory, a territory disputed by the Israelis and now the Palestinians. It's really wrong to say that settlements emerged in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to stop a Palestinian state from emerging. Now, it is very legitimate to say that there are people today trying to settle in the West Bank who are doing so for the stated goal of preventing the emergence of a Palestinian state. And you have settlements today that are old school settlements of secular Israelis who are not religiously driven in any kind of way, and they've just lived there for 50 years and they would like to keep living there. And then there's others who, again, want to keep building.
In the 1990s, the Oslo Accords were established as a step towards a final peace settlement. The Accords established Area A, B, and C in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. Area A is under full Palestinian control. Area B is under Palestinian civil control and Israeli security control, and Area C is under full Israeli control. After the Accords, however, the process broke down and the final status of the area has yet to be determined. So now we've begun to understand the history and context of the settlements, two big questions emerge. One, is what they are doing legal? And two, do these settlements pose an obstacle to peace? But before we look into these questions, I wanted to find out more about the settlers. Specifically, how they react to the idea that they are extremists.
Well, Roger, first, I'm not crazy about the term settler. I think the terminology is often used to paint a picture. And as you travel around Ariel, you'll see at the East End we have a university with more than 15,000 students. At the West End, the industry is more than 200 plants. Just across the street from where we're sitting, a center for the performing arts, shopping centers, etc., etc. This is not a settlement. It's certainly not a small encampment with a bunch of rowdy settlers and some grazing goats. That's not real. But this impression that not only are these settlers, these, I don't know, out in the wild, wild West Bank, and that they're out here causing trouble or part of a conflict, that narrative is just divorced from the reality that we live here as well. So when we wake up in the morning, we don't try to find people to skirmish with, we find people to partner with.
We're considered the bloodthirsty settlers.
Yes.
I'm not hurting anybody.
We are the nation of God, and He wants us to be here to show His justice and light to all the world. This is my goal. I don't want to fight for this. If I have to fight, I will.
Sometimes it's the extreme settlers that I was referencing earlier who don't want to see a Palestinian state, who throw rocks at Palestinians and who set their olive orchards on fire and who cut down their olive trees. And even, I mean, horrible individuals like Amiram Ben Uziel, the Jewish terrorist who went and set a Palestinian home on fire in Duma and murdered most of the Dawabsha family. And I'll say his name because he is a disgusting individual who was thrown into Israeli jail and is serving a life sentence, as he should. And by the way, his appeal to the High Court in Israel was just turned down by the High Court.
What you see on the news, these Hilltop youth, they're a couple dozen people. You would think that they're hundreds or thousands of people, but they're not. It's just so much media attention on this.
Sure.
And that's the situation.
The Hilltop Youth are a group of young Israelis that have engaged in acts of violence and vandalism against Palestinians.
It's really sad. Most of these incidents are from Noar Gvaot, from Hilltop Youth. We have a farm here on the Yishuv. These boys, like, who have been told their whole lives that they're failures, they haven't been able to do anything, they don't go to school, nothing, and they come here, and then immediately they're given 300 sheep, which is a lot of money, and they say take them out to graze in the mountains. And all of a sudden these boys who have been failures their whole lives and been told they can't do anything are suddenly doing something, and they're accomplishing.
One of these farmers that has underprivileged children is Naama Atidia.
כל עוד הבית ברמה הכי בסיסית, אי אפשר היה להגיע לכל בית ובית ובית, כמו שצריך להגיע בחברה שלנו, להגיע לבתים, חינוך מחדש מגיל צעיר, של איך מדברים אחד עם השני, ואיך מכבדים אחד את השני, ואיך מדברים לאמא, איך מדברים לאבא. לראות את אבא ואמא מכבדים אחד את השני, בתור ילד פלסטיני או בתור ילד, גם ילד ישראלי, זה לא משנה. זה הבסיס בשביל בכלל לייצר שלום. ואני מרגישה שכמדינה ריבונית יש לנו אחריות לראות את החברה הזאת ולהבין מה אנחנו יכולים, איך אנחנו יכולים לסייע. אנחנו יושבים היום פה בחווה הזאת. יש פה ערבים מסביב. בתוך החווה איפה יש לנו כוח? בתוך החווה, בתוך מה שיצרנו. אז אנחנו עושים, הנוער שחי פה ולומד פה, הוא עובד פה בחקלאות, הוא לומד איך להתייחס לטבע, איך להתייחס לעץ, איך להתייחס לכבשה, לכבד את הטבע, לכבד את האדמה, להרים זבל מהאדמה, לשמור על האדמה יפה ונקייה, לא באנו לפה סתם. החווה הזאת בעצם ממקום פרטי, אנחנו בעצם מקבלים נוער שלא רוצה ללכת לבית ספר. זה יכול להיות בחלופת מעצר, זה יכול להיות דרך איזו עובדת סוציאלית או איזשהו שופט, אבל זה גם יכול להיות נער או נערה שעל הכיפק, הבית בסדר, הכל בסדר, כולם על הכיפק, כן? הבית אבל בסדר. פשוט רוצים טבע, מרחבים, רוצים מקום אחר לגדול בו, ובעצם החווה, אנחנו בעצם מאפשרים לבני נוער להיות כאן, וגם לחבר'ה שעושים פה שנת שירות.
You don't see mainstream people throwing rocks and like losing it one day. You know, that just doesn't happen.
No one here has something that they're against Arabs or that they hate Arabs as a whole. Ideally, we would all want peace. Like I know of my parents' stories, my grandma's stories, you know, in Bet Lechem, she lives right across in Gilo, where they would go in and be neighbors and help each other or whatnot. Like I think ideally we would all want that, you know, but peace takes two sides. And I think for the most part, when I'm driving on the roads with my kids and I'm getting rocks thrown at me with my kids from other kids, like how do you go and fix that type of education?
While the common theme among settlers was a desire to get along and even work with their Palestinian neighbors, I did get a different feeling from Herbie the baker.
I'd rather see the PA go straight to hell and all the Hamas and Hezbollah go straight to hell, all of them. I don't mind the Arabs being here. See, the problem is you don't know what's a good Arab. That's a problem. I remember this was like years and years and years ago. There was a vegetable market, I think it was in Zichron Yaakov, whereas his worker had been working for him for 20 years, and he took out a knife and tried to kill him because they were going to hurt his family if he didn't do that. So who knows what's a good Arab? You don't know.
For Herbie, his concern was not that he didn't want to employ or work with his Palestinian neighbors, but he felt experience taught that the safety risk of a Palestinian being radicalized against Jewish people was too high. Among most of the settlers I spoke to, the message was different.
I spent a lot of time in Jaffa. I like the sound of the Arabs, the Muslims, the mosque. I like it.
וגם המצב, אני רואה אנשים, אני כל הזמן פוגש אנשים, אני מדבר ערבית. אני מדבר עם הרבה אנשים פה באזור, יוצא לי לפגוש אנשים פנים אל פנים, לא בקטע של פוליטיקה, אלא ממש אחד על אחד, אתה ממש רואה, אתה יכול לשמוע את האנשים ואת המצוקה שלהם ואת הסבל שלהם, ואני באמת חושב שהם סובלים. ובגלל שהם סובלים, אז הם עושים את כל מה שהם עושים. כשהיה פה, נגיד, לפני האינתיפאדה הראשונה, אני זוכר שהיינו נוסעים דרך רמאללה, דרך בית לחם, דרך חברון, דרך שכם. נכנסים, לא הייתה שום בעיה. אמא שלי עשתה את הרישיון נהיגה שלה בעזה. אני לא רוצה לחשוב מה יקרה עכשיו אם היא תיכנס לעזה. כי באמת יש שם הרבה אנשים טובים. אני מכיר הרבה אנשים ואנשים טובים, למרות שגם אם הם אנשים טובים וגם אני נגיד ממש חבר או אפילו הולך לבקר אותם בבית, אני עדיין לפעמים קצת מפחד שיקרה לי משהו. אני אף פעם לא יכול לסמוך על מישהו ב100%. כי היו מקרים שהיו נגיד פועלים שעבדו אצל חקלאי 20 שנה. הבן אדם כל בוקר בא לעבודה, יושב, עובד איתך בחממה, בחקלאות, ויום אחד הוא בא ודוקר את המעביד שלו, שהם חברים. הוא היה מזמין אותו לחתונות, הוא היה בא לחתונות בכפר, זה היה מזמין אותו לאירועים שלו. זה היה ממש כאילו חיים משותפים, אבל אותו פועל קיבל איום מאיזשהו ארגון טרור, אולי חמאס או משהו כזה, ואומרים לו, תשמע, אם אתה לא פוגע בו, אנחנו נפגע במשפחה שלך. אז הבן אדם עושה את החשבון, ואומר, אין לי מה לעשות, שמים אותי פה בפינה, ואני חייב לעשות את זה.
אז אני חייב להגיד שיש לי חברים בכפרים פה ליד, חברים מאוד טובים, ערבים, מוסלמים, ואין לי בעיה עם אנשים שהם שוחרי שלום ורוצים לגור איתנו בשכנות טובה. ידנו מושטת לשלום, לגמרי, במובן האמיתי. כמובן, אלו שרוצים לגדוע את חיינו ואת הישיבה שלנו פה, אנחנו לא מסכימים איתם. אבל ידנו מושטת לשלום, ויש לי חברים באזור, חברים טובים אפילו, שאנחנו מדברים לא מעט. אני דובר ערבית, כך שאין לי בעיה עם השפה. ובסך הכל, אם אנחנו נדבר בגובה העיניים, ואני הרבה פעמים אומר נדבר בגובה הלב, אנחנו נצליח למצוא שפה משותפת. אני רוצה להוסיף משהו, שבחזון שלנו, בהקמת המפעל הזה, בהחלט חשבנו שאנחנו נעסיק אנשים עם צרכים מיוחדים מכל האזור. וזה לא משנה אם הם יהודים, מוסלמים או נוצרים, כי בסוף אנשים צרכים מיוחדים הם אנשים צרכים מיוחדים, והלב שלנו פתוח לכולם.
You never hear the word settlements used in the context of Israel without it being preceded by the word illegal. I wanted to delve deeper into international law and see whether this is indeed the case. On December the 23rd, 2016, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 2334, stating that Israel's settlements constituted a flagrant violation of international law and has no legal validity. But this resolution has no legal standing itself because it is a non-binding resolution. The resolution tries to argue settlements are illegal from pre-existing international law. So let's look into this. What does binding international law say about the settlements? Let's first explore the role of indigenous rights in international law. As we saw earlier, the Jewish people began their journey in this land 3,000 years ago. All the places I visited on my trip to Israel are places the Jewish people have historical and biblical connection to. Judea was the birthplace of King David and the location of Jerusalem, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Judah. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. Shiloh in Samaria is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the location of the tabernacle before the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem. Hebron was an important city and a center of worship, and where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah were buried in the cave of the patriarchs.
There are very few peoples in the world, the Chinese, the Indians, but very few people in the world that have a recorded history in a land the way the Jews have in the land of Israel. It's harder to say whether the Palestinian Arabs are indigenous. There certainly have been Arabs in this land longer than there have been Muslims in Israel, which means that their history is 1,000 years shorter than the Jews, but then there are very few people who have as long a history in this land as in the Jews anywhere in the world.
There are several examples of binding international law that recognizes the rights of indigenous people to settle the land they come from. However, these rights in international law are somewhat vague because the practical parameters can be hard to define.
The word settler is being used very promiscuously and in an entirely negative way. Settlers include the Prime Minister of Israel living in downtown Jerusalem, the businessman living in Tel Aviv, a child living in Bnei Brak. To others, settlers would include everybody who lives in any area that was captured by Israel in the defensive war in 1967, including the people who used to live in Gaza who left, the people who live in the Golan Heights, which is now part of Israel, people who live in Ma'ale Adumim, which will become part of Israel under any settlement, and also people who live in areas that will likely become part of a Palestinian state if a two-state solution is ever adopted. So we have to be far more precise in using the term settler and make sure we use it in a neutral way, in a descriptive way, rather than in an invidious way, because the law regarding such people is very complicated.
Some of the legal experts I spoke to also said that the use of the term settler is a tactical ploy to sever or hide the indigenous connection the Jews have to these lands.
Describing them as settlers is describing them as non-indigenous, as people who arrived there, and due to other developments, it's a way of insinuating that they're wrongdoers, that they're some sort of criminals. Now, actually, the French language media has the English language media topped here. They don't mess around. They don't call them settlers. They certainly don't call them residents. They call them colonists. When the Israeli left uses the term in English, when they're speaking in English and they call someone a settler, they're referring to Jews who live in the West Bank, not including Jerusalem. When Europeans use the term, they'll use it to also include Jews living in primarily Arab neighborhoods or in parts of Jerusalem that were occupied by Jordan. And sometimes they'll use it just to describe more generally Jews living in predominantly Arab areas. And then you ask Palestinian, when they use the term, they're using it to describe every single Jew living in the Holy Land. And all of this is because settler to them does not mean someone who is somehow involved in the formal act of being transferred. What they mean is a Jew living in a place where they think Jews ought not to live. My point of view as a liberal, I find it disturbing that we should assume that there is wrongdoing involved in people living in a particular place simply because of their ethnicity. It's an attenuated legal argument that doesn't really hold water. There is no relevant international law about settling or settlements or being a settler. Those are media terms.
So, Jews can claim indigeneity to these territories, but as we've seen, the rights of indigenous people in international law are ambiguous. So back to our question, what does binding international law say about who has the right to this land today? Let's rewind to World War I. In 1916, a secret treaty was established between Britain and France, known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they agreed on the boundaries of British and French spheres of influence in the region on the assumption they would win the war. This agreement played a significant role in determining the borders of many modern-day Middle Eastern states, including Iraq, Kuwait, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and of course the future Jewish homeland in Palestine. In 1917, the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire and declared their support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This was known as the Balfour Declaration. The area they designated as Palestine did not just include what is now Israel, it also included the areas of Judea and Samaria, i.e. the West Bank, and even the entirety of Jordan. Then in 1920, an international conference was held in San Remo, Italy, where the principal Allied powers of World War I voted to recognize, quote, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and the reconstitution of their national home in the region. This conference led to a further meeting in 1922 of the League of Nations, a precursor to the United Nations, where these proposals were formalized under international law. So that means that according to international law, established in 1922, the Jewish people were given the right to a homeland in not just territory that is part of modern-day Israel, but also the area often referred to as the West Bank. While the British Mandate of Palestine originally included Jordan, it was separated into its own Arab state, which, as it happens, today contains a Palestinian majority.
The Balfour Declaration, the San Remo Conference, they are integral to the recognition by the international community of the indigenous right of Jews to settle in the land. And in fact, the mandate made specific provision for the close settlement. So in a sense, these political and legal instruments are crucial in that they provide that historical legal context.
So it was clearly established in international law way back in 1920 that the Jewish people had the right to set up a homeland, certainly in all of the territories that are under dispute today. But what if you don't consider these legal agreements to be valid because they were established by colonial powers?
If you don't accept them, then there is no state of Jordan, there is no state of Iraq. So the idea of ever calling Israel a colonialist or a settler state is so anti-history and so ignorant of the realities of what occurred.
So there is clearly a precedent in international law that grants the Jewish people the right to the land referred to as settlements. But what if that's not good enough for you? What if you say that since 1948 this territory legally belongs to the Palestinian Arabs? The question is, on what basis? If you want to say it belongs to them based on the UN's 1947 partition plan, even if this plan was binding in international law, which it isn't, you still have the problem that the Arabs rejected the proposal. Then Jordan came and occupied the territory from 1948. But there's no legal basis for their occupation. So when in 1967 Israel captured the area of the West Bank in a defensive war, who had the legal right to it in the first place? It couldn't have been the Jordanians. They had no legal right to it. And the Palestinian Arabs rejected the UN partition plan. So the only precedent you have to go back to is the 1922 League of Nations mandate that allocated the area for a future Jewish homeland. Moreover, when Israel took control of the West Bank from Jordan in 1967, it did so in a war of self-defense. The inherent right to self-defense is recognized in Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is also binding in international law.
The question I'm often asked as a lawyer is the occupation of the West Bank legal? And the answer to that is clearly, unequivocally, yes, it's legal. That any country is entitled to occupy areas that it won in a defensive war until there is no longer any belligerency. That's what the United States did in Japan. That's what the United States did in Germany. That's what many other countries did. There has been no end of belligerency.
It's clear in international law that territory captured in a defensive war is legal. So why do some people argue that the settlers are living there illegally?
All of the legal arguments stem from a peculiar interpretation of the 6th paragraph of Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention. It's an interpretation that seems to apply only in the context of Israel.
Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention says that while a state may occupy land in a defensive war, they cannot start transferring their own civilians to the occupied territory. This provision was included in response to the practices of Nazi Germany during World War II, which involved forcibly transferring German populations into territories it had occupied in Eastern Europe. The provision was seen as an important step in ensuring that the transfer of populations was no longer used as a tool of oppression and control during times of armed conflict. It is this legislation that has been the basis for those arguing Israeli settlers are violating international law. But Israel argues that this law cannot apply to these territories because the land was not under the recognized sovereignty of any state at the time of its capture. But also, because the Fourth Geneva Convention is talking about a nation forcefully moving their citizens into the land captured in a defensive war. But in Israel's case, the settlers aren't being forced to move. They are moving to these areas or already living there voluntarily.
Most of the residents, most of the Jewish residents of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, lived there all their lives. They've not been moved from one side of the line to the other. And perhaps their parents or their grandparents moved there, but they didn't move anywhere. So they were never transferred. What's more is, even if they had been transferred, there's no reason to think that it's a crime to be transferred. The crime, if there would be any, would be Israel forcing them to move there. But the people who live there have as much right to live there as anyone else. Now, let me just push forward with this argument that I think it's, again, I think this argument is silly. It's not applied anywhere else in the world.
When we're looking at double standards in international law, it's also really important to understand how settlement activity in the context of real situations of occupation as envisaged by the Fourth Geneva Convention, are addressed by the international community. And Professor Eugene Kondratovich has conducted a very detailed survey of these instances and concludes that in every case, the concept of Article 49.6 being applied and the idea that this activity is recognised as illegal is simply non-existent. So these are blatant double standards, and it's not the case that these instances have escaped international condemnation. In many of these examples, there are other criticisms that have been made of wide-scale human rights abuses that have accompanied these programs, but in not one of them is Article 49.6 used as a way of describing illegal settlement activity. It's only with respect to Israel.
The international lawyers I spoke to argued that it's not simply a question of double standards, but that even in situations of real occupation where the Geneva Convention clearly applies, the transfer of settlements is not regarded as illegal. This undermines any argument under international law advanced against Israel in this respect. There seems to be an inversion of international law, essentially, and a complete abuse of the international legal order vis-à-vis Israel. Thus, a more accurate term for these territories would be a disputed territory. It is for these reasons that the United States announced in 2019 that Israeli settlements do not violate international law.
The establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not, per se, inconsistent with international law.
Ironically, the only notable times Israel has forcibly moved their citizens from a territory under their control was when they were moving their own citizens out of territories as a gesture for peace. In 1982, Israeli settlements were forcibly evacuated and demolished in the Sinai Peninsula as part of a land for peace deal with Egypt. And similarly, in 2005, Jews were forcibly evacuated from Gaza by their own government, and the land was handed to the Palestinians for self-government. Another irony of accusing Israelis as illegal settlers is that under the Oslo Accords, Palestinians are not allowed to settle in Area C. Yet I discovered that for many years there have been illegal Palestinian construction in Area C funded by the EU.
And you can see colors, illegal Palestinian construction. This is yellow since 2007, and blue is 18, 19, 21. And you can see just filled with dots. And if we will travel, we will see the signs by the road. Which European country funded everything?
I have neighbors, if they would like to add just a storage warehouse or whatever on next to their house, on their own property, if they do it without the proper permits, it'll get destroyed. It would be nice if the tables were turned and we would just be able to actually build, where we're legally allowed to build. We're not even looking to expand beyond that.
So it's clear from the legal experts that there is a double standard being applied to Israel settlements and an ignoring of international law, both in other countries and with regard to Palestinian settlement building. A third area in which a double standard seems apparent is in the focus on boycotting Israel on the questionable basis of illegal settlements. Some companies, organizations, and individuals have singled out Israel for boycotts, despite trading with other countries such as China, who have blatant human rights abuse records. For example, Ben & Jerry's attempted to block the sale of their ice cream in the settlement territories. Although when asked in an interview about why they only sought to boycott Israel, but not other states, they had this to say.
We hugely support Israel's right to exist, but we are against a particular policy.
You guys are big proponents of voting rights. Why do you still sell ice cream in Georgia? Texas, abortion bans. Why are you still selling there?
I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I don't know what that would accomplish. We're working on those issues of voting rights and I don't know. I think you ask a really good question, and I think I'd have to sit down and think about it for a bit.
I decided to ask the settlers what their thoughts were on these boycotts.
SodaStream being one of them. SodaStream is a great example of how BDS has never, ever caused an Israeli company to close. It has caused a select number of Israeli companies to reorganize, like SodaStream, and the upshot of that is twofold. The first, Palestinians lose their jobs because the company moves to the other side of the Green Line. Second, the company, through a reorganization process, takes advantage of that new momentum, and in that case, they sold the company for more than $3 billion. So if BDS wants to assist the Israeli economy, they can keep up their work. The challenge with BDS is not the economy, it's the delegitimization of Israel. It's the guilty by association. It's the fear-mongering, and making people feel uncomfortable to do business with the businesses here. So they're really not interested in the reality. They're actually not interested in the Palestinians. They are interested in trying to find some way to delegitimize the Israelis. That's tragic. And in that respect, they do have quote-unquote success. So if you take them to court, as happened with Ben & Jerry's and Unilever, the boycotters lose.
Rivka Naomi Green is the content manager of Lev Ha'olam, an organization that helps to distribute settler goods to supporters of Israel around the world. Lev Ha'olam was set up as a way to counter the BDS movement.
Really, these are people that want to work. They want to create. They don't want to hand out. They want to leave the world a better place than they found it. And really what they need is a bridge that will connect them to people like yourself, people who love Israel.
I have 110 people working with me. 80 of them, 80 of them Palestinian, 35 of them Israelis. And I can give to my worker at the end of the year bonus. I can give them a good condition, salary condition. We always going for vacation every year for a few days. We are a big family.
Unfortunately, most Palestinians that work for Israelis were not comfortable to be filmed because they believed, probably rightly, that publicizing their connection with Israelis could threaten the safety of themselves and their families. This is a sad reflection on the level of hostility that exists. For the few that were okay to be filmed, we have blurred their faces and altered their voices in order to protect their safety.
The people who are working with me, I think we can speak with them, but this is us. This is a Lipsky. This is a hope that this place gives to the people. You can see Israeli and Palestinian who are going for vacation, or know how to take a day off together and enjoy, and that's my story.
אפילו, יש לנו בו שנים, עובדים ביחד.
They are here for years, working together.
הולכים לטיולים, הולכים לחיים שלנו ביחד, בוא נגיד.
Traveling together, living together.
בו, גדלנו בו.
The growing here, the study here.
Segregation between the communities is most poignant when it comes to not necessarily Israeli security policy, but Palestinian Authority anti-normalization policy. With anti-normalization policy, there are literally laws on the books that prevent Palestinians from, again, doing business with Israelis, Every day that a Palestinian comes and works for an Israeli employer in this region, what we refer to as Judea and Samaria, what the world refers to as the West Bank, every Palestinian who does that, by the tens of thousands, is breaking the law every time they do that. We don't have free access to one another's communities. I can't go into Salfit down the road, and people from Salfit can't come into Ariel unless they have special work permits.
אני יכולה להגיד, הלוואי שלא יהיה פה ערבים, אבל זה לא המציאות. הערבים חיים פה, הם גרים פה, והם בני אדם. אני לא חושבת שצריך להרוג אף אחד, אני לא חושבת, אתה יודע, אלא אם כן מישהו מנסה להרוג אותי, אבל גם בתוך האוכלוסייה הערבית יש הרבה אנשים טובים. והאינטראקציות שקורות בין האנשים האלה לבין יהודים, לבין מתנחלים, זה קורה כאן. זה לא קורה בתל אביב ובהרצליה.
I definitely do not think that every Arab is a terrorist. That is definitely not the way that I see things. But we are very aware of the security threat that does exist. We have many Palestinian workers that come in every day to work in the yishuv, and they all need permits.
Here in this area, a working Jewish and Muslim from Jericho and from this area and from Jerusalem, they work together. We live together really nicely.
You have some Palestinians working in here?
Yeah, in the vineyards, there's a lot of Palestinians that are working with us, and we're very happy to do it.
If you want to see peace, this is the place to see it. The workers who work with us are Arabs. Half of our day we are here together. When we continue to work and get to know each other and the families, everything is okay. We created a new language which combines Hebrew, Arabic, and English.
And Chinese also.
Yeah. The future.
Future looking bright.
And people, Palestinian. I feel everybody human. I don't care that's Jewish, Arabic, doesn't matter. We are here like a family until now. Nothing we care about politics, nothing. We work, that's it. Don't care about anything else.
Go to any Arab outside, even those which have some Palestinian flags, and ask them, would you like to get Israeli citizenship right now? All of them will want it.
I have good relations with my Arab neighbors. In many ways, and the Arabs, we are very close. We are very warm people. We love our families.
My worker, the Palestinian worker, earn double three what they're earning in the Palestinian Authority. If you will speak in the Arabs and tell them what they want, I am sure that 95% of the people who live here, they want to live in quiet. If you are going now to factories there and tell them without camera and speak with them like us, they will tell you like that. I want quiet.
Tell us your story.
Yes, نحن بفلسطين وإسرائيل يعني نحن فريندز زي أصدقاء يعني no problem بيني وبين معلم زي رائيل يعني زي معلم بو يعني كويس توف يعني جود يعني نو بعياء بيننا وهيك يعني كل المشاكل بتصير يعني من رئيس لرئيس يعني نحن كمواطنين في دولة إسرائيل سواء أو فلسطين يعني نحن زي أصحاب وأهل وجيران يعني إن فينا مشاكل ولا في إشي يعني نحن بعربين بإسرائيل لورتسي بعياء يعني كان نحن بوبل لورتسي بروبلم
لا أين بعيا؟
سلام.
Peace.
Peace. Yeah. روت بروبلم يعني زي مات يعني مات لورتسي. أبا شيلي مات لورتسي نحن روتسي سلام يعني لورتسي معايا ومشاكل وزي مشاكل يعني لطوف. يعني أنا ساكن بتقول سيدة وزي ساكن بو. يعني ليش يعني يصير بيننا مشاكل ويصير بيننا حروب ويصير بيننا يعني كل بيت يعني تفجير وهيك يعني احنا بدنا نعيش بسلام. احنا بدناش مشاكل بدنا نعيش يعني احنا بدنا نعيش حياتنا بسلام.
One of the common themes I heard from Jewish settlers was their belief that when their cameras were away, many Palestinians would rather be living in Israel than the Palestinian territories. For the economic benefits, better security and more political freedom. The polling among Palestinians does not corroborate this, and of course living in a Jewish state would hamper the Palestinian cause for statehood, but even the polling itself is hard to rely on because it is hard to discern whether comments are influenced by peer pressure.
So in 2017, a group of business associates and myself decided to found a Chamber of Commerce. We didn't found this nonprofit until we knew that we had Palestinian partners who would be on the founding board and would continue with the leadership and of course the membership. And we quickly grew to hundreds of businesses, Israelis and Palestinians. And we've grown to develop some strategic economic plans and to implement some of those plans. In 2019, with the Peace to Prosperity workshop, which the United States led in Bahrain, and they invited representatives from across the world to create an economic growth plan of $50 billion for the Palestinians. The only challenge is the Palestinian Authority didn't show up. Palestinian Authority's approach was very simple. First, we want a state, then we can talk about economics and prosperity. The only challenge is, again, the Palestinian people, the Palestinian street didn't see things that way. But how could the Palestinian street show up to Bahrain if the Palestinian Authority was boycotting it? That same Ashraf Jabari, who I mentioned before, came as a representative of the Judea and Samaria Chamber of Commerce and brought a delegation of 10 representatives who said, yes, we're open for business. We, the Palestinian business community, would love to do business and we'd love to see economic prosperity.
I spoke to Avi Zimmerman's co-founder of the Judea and Samaria Chamber of Commerce, Sheikh Ashraf Jabari, a Palestinian Arab who supports growing economic ties between Israelis and Palestinians in the whole region.
2017, we built Judea and Samaria Chamber Commerce to build a new road to really peace between the Palestinian and the Israeli. There is not solution. Only we live in this region, no another way to peace process. We work with the Israelis every day. You can see this every day in the morning, 200,000 workers enter to Israel and return to the West Bank. In West Bank, we have 50,000 workers every day. 90% in the Palestinian people, they want the solution, the problem with the Palestinian Authority. Anybody who want peace, want to work with the Israelis, there is hit him and arrested him. The problem with the Palestinian Authority.
ובחלק הזה גרים גם שכנינו הפלסטינאים, והם שכנים שלנו לכל דבר ועניין. הם עובדים כאן, יש לי 15 עובדים פלסטינאים, חלקם איתי מהיום הראשון, חברים ממש קרובים. אנחנו מתארחים אצלם, הם באים אלינו ואנחנו עובדים בחברות נורא טובה. זה אף פעם לא היווה בעיה, גם בטיולים שלנו אנחנו עוברים דרך השבטים הבדואים. הילדים נורא מחכים שם לקבוצות שלנו שבאות ולפעמים מחלקות להם כל מיני דברים. זה מאוד מעניין את שתי הצדדים. חשוב לנו מאוד להראות, במיוחד לתיירים שלנו, אבל גם לישראלים, שכאן זה לא התקשורת, וכאן לא קורה בפועל מה שאנחנו רואים בטלוויזיה בכל העולם. כאן זה מקום קטן, שקט, עם חברות מאוד טובה ושכנות טובה בינינו לבין השכנים שלנו הפלסטינאים. אנחנו אף פעם לא נתקלנו בבעיות.
We've looked at the historical record and we've looked at the issue of international law. But even if there is a strong legal justification for Israelis to live in these territories, the question I am often asked is, so what? Even if it is legal, it's not moral. Because when Jews and Israeli citizens move to these territories, it makes a future Palestinian state harder to carve out.
I know that it's hard for you to think about those nice farmers that you met who try to end up the day and BDS might affect their lives.
Well,
yes
I
or
mean,
not.
I can give you Dershowitz's argument about why they're not illegal.
Bottom line, they are a huge impediment to a future Palestinian state. They make the lives, even before speaking about Palestinians, they make the lives of Palestinians impossible.
Activists like Matan believe the settlements are not only illegal, but immoral because they pose an obstacle to peace. But then there's others like Einat Wilf, a former Israeli politician from the centre-left, as part of Israel's Labour Party. Einat acknowledges that the settlements are not illegal, but she believes they just aren't helpful because they are a waste of Israeli resources, given that if a Palestinian state is likely to be carved out in the region of Judea and Samaria, most Israelis will want to leave.
Generally, I think that the entire settlement project has been Israel's most wasteful and useless project. Yes to the occupation, no to the settlements. I separate between the settlements that I think, again, are wasteful and useless, and it's time that we just stop them, and between the military presence in the West Bank that I believe continues to be necessary as long as the Palestinians are still waging a century-plus long war against the very existence of a Jewish state and any borders. And the occupation is actually a legal form of controlling a territory captured in war until it is decided through peace and negotiations what to do with that territory. And Israel has repeatedly tried to end its military control of the West Bank through a series of agreements. But again, Palestinians walk away again and again because their goal has never been to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza next to a Jewish state, but rather, to their credit, they've been consistent and clear from the river to the sea.
I decided to put it to the Israeli settlers directly. Would they leave if the territories they were in became part of a future Palestinian state? If, for instance, they found a way for peace, but the Jews had to move back to Israel, what would you do? Would you move, or would you? No, you stay here. No, I stay. You're not moving.
I stay here.
Yeah, and everybody you think is the same.
Yes.
It doesn't matter.
We are staying here.
If it will be like not possible to live here, then I'll go. It's not like you hold it anyway, but I'll try. I'll try my best because I really believe that this is our land.
But if I'm under their jurisdiction and Hamas is ruling them, I'm not so sure I'd be able to walk around the way I'm dressed right now. I have no idea how it would be.
So the answers I received were mixed. Some Israelis would stay and some would leave. Regardless of whether they would stay or not, we return to our original question. Are these settlements an obstacle to peace? Anti-settler activist Matan believes that the occupation and Israel's security measures infringe on Palestinian liberties and encourage Palestinians to become extremists.
As long as the only thing they know of Israelis and Jews is the soldier on the checkpoint and the tank and the D9 that destroyed the terrorist's house, of course, that will not happen. So it's true, speaking like you went and spoke to Arabs and Palestinians, this is a great start for everyone. But how many of the Jews in Israel that you know actually went and tried to create empathy and understand where the Palestinians are coming from? Probably not many.
But others would respond to Matan that whenever Israel has made gestures for peace, they have been rejected by the Palestinians.
Settlements are an issue. They are not the obstacle to peace. And any Israeli that you ask today, if you said, if we removed all settlements tomorrow, would we have peace the next day? They would say, you're crazy. And so the idea, a lot of Israelis would say, if you pulled out all the settlements from the West Bank tomorrow, in a year, maybe 6 months, Hamas would take over, just like they did in Gaza. And we have a precedent right there from not very long ago that demonstrates that. The Palestinians today, many would say, we do not want Jews in our country, but they won't say it that way. They'll say we don't want settlers in our country. Now, the only difference between a Jew and a settler in their mind is where that Jew lives. If they live in the West Bank, they've become a settler. If they're nowhere in the West, then they're a Jew. And they would say, well, we don't have a problem with Jews living in our country. We have a problem with settlers living in our country. But wait a second, as soon as they move into territory that you think is yours, they become settlers. So basically, you don't want Jews living in your country. In the West Bank, The notion that the only way to solve the conflict is to remove all of the Jews from that territory and leave a Palestinian state, Judenrein, as the Germans would say, free of Jews, is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous notion. In fact, one could actually argue that if you removed all of the Jews, anti-Semitism could then reign freely without anything stopping it. There are today, according to the IDF, there's between 2.8 and 3 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank, and about 450,000 Jews who live in the West Bank. The idea that somehow the Jews are all of a sudden going to take over, even with rapid settlement expansion, which isn't happening, right, is just a ridiculous notion. And actually, if you're really liberal, right, and want democracy, how could you ever support an idea that says that people can't live somewhere simply because of who they are? In a Palestinian state, Palestinians as the majority, Jews as the minority, and in Israel, Jews as the majority and Arabs as the minority, and have that be the liberal democracy, Western liberal democracies that I think most people watching this support and believe in. They would be a minority voting in a government, and yeah, the hope is that there would be Jewish representation in that government the same way that 23% of the population of Israel is Arab, and they also have representation in the government. Let's also understand settlements take up less than 10% of the land in the West Bank. So we're not talking about, you know, settlements gobbling up all of the land of what's going to become a Palestinian state. It's been 50 years, 55 years that the settlement movement has been active. Less than 10% of the land and less than 500,000. Yes, they would be a minority, but they would remain a minority, just like Arabs will remain a minority in Israel.
It seems pretty clear to me that settlements are not necessarily an obstacle to peace, because under a two-state solution, land swaps could be agreed, and the only Palestinian state that Israel could believe was a partner for peace would be one in which Jews would be allowed to live in. But on the subject of making peace, there was another question that I had for the settlers. What was their vision for Israel's future? What did they want? 2 states? 1 state? And how would it work? The answers I received were varied.
That's going to depend on all the Jews of the diaspora and when they're going to move here and what the future of Israel will be.
I'm not sure how many solutions you said there might be out there, but there's certainly more than 2. And anyone who oversimplifies this and makes it sound like arithmetic when it's calculus is not understanding the reality or wants to blind us to many, many layers of complexity that we could explore.
I can't foresee a 2-state solution because the other state doesn't want this one around.
No.
They only want one anyway. So,
yeah, well, if somebody like Gandhi came along and became the leader of the Palestinians instead of Abbas, and he said, yeah, we need to have peace, we need to work with the Jews.
You can't prove it. You'd have to prove it for 10, 15, 20 years first, and that won't happen.
I'm very surprised that people who claim to be liberal are calling for 2 states, because they are actually expanding the borders of your society instead of contracting them. If they were really liberal, if they really cared about human rights, if they really cared about the people on the ground, they would support Israeli law being applied through all the country to expand these borders of freedom.
On one side, I want 2-state solution. On the other side, I don't believe that Israel can move from the Shomron area.
I think it's like a confederation.
Yeah.
With Israel controlling strategic areas and with the Palestinian population having autonomy for civil issues, I think they prefer it also.
When you decide this is Israel, I promise you the Palestinian will be like the Israeli Arabs. My goal, 10 years from today, that Gush Etzion or Yehuda Veshomron will be part of Israel. And nobody will talk about this is a Palestinian area, Israeli area. And everybody will visit each other. And I have a lot of Palestinian friends. I can go to visit them during the night, have a barbecue, party together. And this is my goal to after 10 years.
My vision is that we'll be able to live one next to the other and you know, ideally one day my child will go to a school in Jerusalem which has a mixed Arabs and Jews and religious and non-religious and learn about each other's community, and maybe one day they'll be able to go to each other's house and visit and see that there's so much more similar than than different.
Me, I believe in that one state or two state solutions should be win-to-win situation for everybody. The best way is that we all together recognize our, each other existence and each other full rights to live here in the region.
The answers I received were varied. Some were happy with a two-state solution. Some wanted one state for all. The big issue that comes up when talking about these solutions is the demographics. People like Issa would propose it would become a binational or Palestinian state, but this defeats the very purpose of Zionism and Jewish self-determination, which requires a Jewish majority. On the other hand, for some of the settlers who proposed that Israel absorbs all of the disputed territories, many believed there are 2 million Palestinians, not 3 million, and so they would say it wouldn't compromise Israel's Jewish majority. However, their figures are disputed, and if there really are 3 million Palestinians, then Israel will be stuck between being Jewish and being democratic. What becomes clear to me is that finding a solution is a complicated business due to the many competing narratives. For each group, their obstacle to peace looks different. But one thing that has become increasingly clear to me, it's hard to argue that the settlements themselves are the obstacle to peace. The problem is ideology. Ideology that cannot make space for the other side. And bad ideology can exist on both sides. Settlements aren't the obstacle, but some settlers' ideology can be. On the Palestinian side, bad ideology has prevented them from acknowledging the right of Jews to a home and refusal to accept a two-state solution on countless occasions. Just in the last few decades, Israel has attempted to sign peace deals in 1993, 2000, 2008, and 2014. But to quote former Israeli diplomat Abba Eban, they have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But now there is a small but existing ideology in Israel that is diverging from Israel's past. This ideology has given up on a two-state solution. It has given up on the idea of Palestinian statehood and has embraced hardline positions. These hardline political parties won 14 seats out of 120 in Israel's 2022 election. These views represent a minority of Israelis, but they represent a new politics that does not see the Palestinians as a partner for peace. But what has allowed this ideology to grow? Why has this development happened? Would it have developed if Israel had found a willing partner for peace? This is not to excuse hardlinism, but to ask what is fueling it. The hardliners have grown intolerant of constant Palestinian terror, incitement, and refusal to acknowledge Israel since her inception. This is the bad ideology, influenced heavily by religious extremism, that has plagued the conflict since the beginning. And it is, in my view, the biggest obstacle to peace.
I can't foresee peace. I can't. Because they're against Jews. Nakuda.
Yeah.
And that's not going to stop.
During the days they're bombing us, even from Gaza, we still give them the electricity and cement, and unbelievable. It's crazy.
The second he goes to pick up his hand, I'm abruptly stopping, and all of a sudden there was like 8 rocks, one after the other, like stones, one after the other. They just missed my car. They hit the car in front of me, which was a Palestinian.
When I was traveling around the settlements, there were signs warning Israelis not to go into Area A, Palestinian-controlled territory, as it would put them in mortal danger because of the level of incitement against Israelis and Jews.
In the end, it's education. In the end, young children grow up and listen to the story of their family, to the story of their moreshet. How do you say moreshet? Of their legacy.
ليش حابة تصيري شرطية؟ ليش؟ زي مين؟ عمو. مين عمو؟ هو شرطي؟ شو بيسوي طب الشرطي؟
بس الحرامي والبيعمل مشاكل.
وبطخ اليهود صح؟ انت بدك تصيري زيه؟ ان شاء الله لما تكبري. بطخ اليهود. كلهم؟
אי אפשר, אנחנו יש לנו המון רצון טוב, אנחנו כל הזמן באים לקראת וזה. מצד שני אתה רק מקבל פיגועים ודקירות וזה, כי באמת המצב שלהם הוא מצב על הפנים, זה מצב שקשה לחיות בו.
From the Arab and especially Palestinian perspective, the conflict has never been about the settlements. The conflict has always been for this last century, and to the credit of the Palestinians, they've been both clear and consistent about it. It has been about the denial of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in any borders and in any part of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea.
Israel has no right to exist.
But Israel has demonstrated its ruthless and effective ability to dismantle settlements for the cause of peace, as in the case of Egypt, and for much less in the case of Gaza and the northern West Bank. And Israel will do so again if peace is really on the horizon, if it's possible.
One of the concerns I heard time and again from Israelis was their concern that evacuating from the settlements and ending their occupation would lead to a Hamas-style government as it did in Gaza. I put this question to Issa Amro. Was there a danger of a Hamas takeover if Israel left?
Hamas is not the representative of the Palestinian people, and the majority of the Palestinian people, when we end the occupation, they will stop supporting any kind of violence. It's something very important. And let me be honest with you. If we take Hamas and remove them now, because it's a new party, a new movement, Hamas. If we take them and, take Hamas away, will the Palestinians have peace? Is the Hamas the main problem? It's the occupation.
I think we need to be clear that the obstacle to peace is the refusal of the Palestinian leadership now and prior Arab leaderships before its creation of the refusal to accept the existence of the State of Israel. This is what governed the establishment of the PLO in 1964. Of course, before there was any question, this was when the West Bank, Judea and Samaria was still in Jordanian occupation. And when it was in Jordanian occupation, it was ethnically cleansed of any Jew. So the fact that the PLO established in 1964 with the sole aim of eradicating the State of Israel before there was a single Jew living in these areas is something that really people need to be more aware of when they're considering obstacles to peace.
I wanted to pick up on Natasha's point with Issa Amro, to ask him why he thought it was that the Palestinian Liberation Organization was set up before Israel took control of the West Bank and there were no settlements or any Jewish presence there.
I'm not the spokesperson of the PLO. I'm not part of the PLO. And I have a huge criticism of the PLO because I'm calling to reform the PLO and make it democratic and engage young voices in the PLO. And the PLO, I don't know about about its history, but as I know that the PLO is recognized as the representative of the Palestinian people, and it was established in the beginning to fight the occupation, but 1965, so before 67. But as you know, the problem didn't start on 1967. It started 1948 and before, even in the 40s and the 30s and the 20s, and a lot of violence was all over from the 20s.
In Issa's response to my question about Palestinian opposition to Israel prior to 1967, before there was a single settlement, he said that the problems went back to 1948. This suggests that his issue is with Israel's very existence.
A lot of people say that the settlers are the obstacle to peace, but it'd be interesting to have your view.
I think the Israeli, mentality of not seeing Palestinians as equal human beings is the main issue. Then the Israeli settlements is the second for me. So if the majority of the Israelis come and say Palestinians are our neighbors and we should have a solution and an end to the occupation, and I think the settlements will be a small problem. In Israel, they don't recognize our rights to exist.
Settlements are a distraction. They are. Talking about settlements is a distraction from the real issues. And the more we talk about them, the more we're not dealing with the real issues, which is going to perpetuate this conflict even more. So I hope that we can start to focus on the real issues.
And the real tragedy is that the Palestinian leadership has no incentive to seek peace. Mahmoud Abbas relies on the perpetuation of the conflict for the continuous international donations which flood in, with which he's often funding terrorism through the pay-for-slay scheme, which pays salaries to terrorists dependent on how many Jews they've been successful in murdering. He also, Mahmoud Abbas, relies on the perpetuation of the conflict for his own hold on political power, because he's able to present the outside enemy, the Jews, the other, and blame that entity for any of the internal difficulties that he faces. And he relies on Israeli security cooperation in the West Bank to prevent a Hamas takeover of power and control in the same way that they took over in the Gaza Strip. There was a violent coup where they threw their opposition Fatah members off of the roofs of buildings. And so when one considers all of these factors, Abbas, and unfortunately anyone who succeeds him, has no incentive to seek an end to the conflict.
We live in one region. We live with the Israeli, and there is not, that's impossible. So we work to a new solution. There is not solution like what the Palestinian Authority want and what the Union Arab want. And you can see how many Palestinian people work with the Israeli.
They're frightened, actually. We have to cut off their faces because they're frightened of the PA recognizing them. So they talk to us, but we cannot show their faces because they're so frightened.
Yes, yes. We can live with the Israeli in a good life. Excellent. But our leaders don't want this solution.
Fair enough.
I talk with you why? Because the Palestinian problem, that's the chicken to give him gold eggs. That's all.
You have other Palestinians whose interactions with Israelis and settlers has been very positive. Okay, it's Palestinians working inside of settlements and having great relationships with their neighbors. And so if you removed all of the Jews from the West Bank, all of the Israelis, and the incitement, which I would argue is the biggest obstacle to peace, is Palestinian government incitement teaching their children that Jews are evil, that Jews are the descendants of apes and pigs, that they should pick up their AK-47s and go fight. The notion that the term AK-47 appears in a children's show should be mind-boggling to any Westerner. Should be the thing that the Westerners are breaking down the doors of the PA saying, how dare you teach children this? That's the biggest obstacle to peace. And if they continue to preach that kind of rhetoric, and now there are no Jews or no Israelis that these Palestinians ever encounter, what's going to stop them from believing it? And so the idea that the solution is completely separating these populations is crazy. You know, a lot of people say to me who promote this, they say, well, Arabs and Jews will never be able to live together. And I look at them and I go, I live in Jerusalem. Arabs and Jews live together every single day, and we're not killing each other. So the notion that that's not possible is crazy. No, the problem is the ideology.
My objective throughout this journey was to look beneath the surface of media narratives about the settlements. The situation is obviously complex and fluid, but one thing is for certain: this is not a conflict you can understand from a brief glance at the news. You have to inquire, to get informed, and meet the people involved to settle the facts. So I won't give you a conclusion. Instead, I invite you to keep on digging, as I have, and to decide for yourselves.
We are Tomer and Shlomit. We wish you Shabbat Shalom from Israel, from Noida. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hashem, Malachei Elyon. Melech Malchei Amelech, Kadosh Baruch. Shalom Aleichem.
Hi everybody, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more on similar topics, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also click on the link in the video description to support our marketing budget. This will help us to spread this video as far as possible throughout the world. Thank you very much for all your support. Hope to see you soon. Roger Walters.